Welcome back, viewers. You are still tuned into Prime Live. As the world prepares to mark 1 year since October 7th, Israel's bombardment of Gaza continues to this day. Gaza's health ministry has put the official death toll at close to 41,700, including more than 16,000 children. 96,625 other Palestinians have been injured in the ongoing attacks as well. The statistics, however, do not include those that are buried under the rubble, and almost every person in Gaza, 2.3 million residents, have been displaced. There is still acute hunger as the civilian populations continue to struggle. Population remains are cut off from water, food, as well as fuel supplies, and Israel has increasingly been isolated by the international community, as seen with the mass walkout during Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's General Assembly address at the United Nations. But can the legal actions that were launched by South Africa, as well as others, actually stop the onslaught? This evening, I'm now joined by lawyer and member of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Dominic Pereira. Good evening, Dominic. Thank you so much for joining us on Prime Live.
Good evening to you and your viewers, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. A lot of people are really confused, so I'm really glad you are joining us this evening, particularly when it comes to the legal implications. I mean, we've seen South Africa challenge Israel at the ICJ. We've also seen some actions at the ICC. But the real question is, can legal challenges to Israel's war on Gaza actually stop continuing the onslaught?
Yes, so perhaps just to make it as simple as I can for your viewers, over the past year, there's actually been three matters that have been taking place at our international courts. Two have been at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, and then another at the ICC, which is the International Criminal Court. Now, some of your viewers may recall that last year in December, South Africa brought this case against Israel for contravening the Genocide Convention on the basis that Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. Now, the ICJ has actually made an interim ruling on that case, and the ICJ has said that based off of the information presented to it by South Africa, that Israel is plausibly committing a genocide. Now, South Africa anticipated, as it correctly actually did so, that ICJ rulings take a number of years, and it is for that reason that it requested provisional orders. And the court did just that. In January, March, and May of this year, the court handed down these provisional measures. Essentially, what these provisional measures amount to was ordering Israel to halt its military offense in Rafah, to open the Rafah crossing to allow humanitarian aid to get into Gaza, and also to allow journalists into Gaza so that they can perform their fact-finding mission. Now, your viewers will appreciate that Israel has actually not adhered to any of these orders. Just quickly on the countries that have actually joined to support South Africa. So there are 8 countries which have currently requested to join these proceedings, the latest of which is the Maldives, that issued a declaration to join on Wednesday. Now, this matter is separate to another matter that has been taking place at the International Court of Justice. In this other matter, it concerns an advisory opinion that the court was actually called upon to decide by the UN General Assembly. And the question that was presented to the court was the legality of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories. And ultimately, what the court found is that Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories, Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is actually unlawful, that Israel should put an end to its unlawful occupation, that it should dismantle its settlements, that it should actually pay reparations to Palestinian victims, and that it should facilitate the return of Palestinians to their homeland. Now, we know that since this ruling that took place, that Israel has actually intensified its attacks, and it has actually increased the number.
Apologies.
Now, that is in relation to the International Court of Justice. There's a separate matter that hasn't quite taken off yet at the International Criminal Court. Now, some of your viewers might not actually know, but Israeli officials have been investigated for war crimes and crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Court as early as 2015. But it was only in May of this year that the chief prosecutor formally applied for arrest warrants against two Israeli senior officials, namely the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense, as well as three other members of Hamas, two of which, by the way, have now been killed. But perhaps just briefly on what these investigations are about against these Israeli officials. So the Rome Statute basically prescribes certain crimes, and Israeli officials are being investigated for breaching these crimes. These are war crimes, crimes against humanity, and using starvation as a method of war. And I mean, the statistics that you referenced at the outset basically confirm all of those. So why it's taking so long is really quite disingenuous of that court.
It absolutely is. And thank you so much for providing such detailed information. I think for the general public, especially when it comes to these legal platforms like the ICJ as well as the ICC, it can be often difficult to be able to differentiate the two and to be able to understand the legal terms and conditions and those kind of things. So thank you for sharing that and outlining that for our viewers this evening. I'm sure that will be very insightful and helpful. But I want to also talk more about what you've mentioned, the development that we are watching very keenly at the ICC, the request for the arrest warrants against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as the Defense Minister. Are you confident that those will be issued?
Well, I mean, let me just get to the first part of your question, which kind of dealt with the difference between the ICJ and the ICC. So, I mean, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, cannot prosecute individuals. So that court basically has two functions. The first function is that it adjudicates disputes between states. And the second function is that it essentially can provide advisory opinions when it is requested to do so. And that court does not have any enforcement mechanisms. This is slightly different to the International Criminal Court that does have enforcement mechanisms. It operates as a criminal court. So a matter will be investigated to it. The chief prosecutor will investigate it. Then what he would probably end up doing is applying for these arrest warrants when they get issued. If they can get these people who've been called to the court to come to the court, then they will do so. A trial will pursue, and essentially what will happen is these people will be put into prison. In relation to your second question, I mean, really the problem with the ICC that we're seeing at the moment in terms of Israel is the issue that Israel is not a signatory to the Rome Statute. So Israel does not recognize the legitimacy of this court. And even if the court were to issue arrest warrants against its senior officials, it would probably disregard that and see them as baseless. So that's really the first issue. The chief prosecutor essentially managed to apply for these warrants on the basis that the alleged crimes are being committed on Palestinian territory, and Palestine is indeed a signatory, and that is how the chief prosecutor essentially found a jurisdiction on that basis. But yes, the court has come under quite a lot of scrutiny as of late. I mean, if you look at the arrest warrant that was given against Russia's president, I mean, that took basically 3 weeks. There's a number of other issues with that court as well. I mean, of the 37 individuals who have received arrest warrants since its inception, all but one of those individuals have come from Africa. So the court is seen to be quite wholly inadequate and insufficient, especially in dealing with the Palestinian crisis.
I think the message that you've summed up is exactly how the general public or supporters of Palestine are feeling at the moment. They almost feel as if, why do these bodies even exist in an international platform if no justice is going to prevail? I mean, the whole world is joining on the bandwagon with South Africa at the ICJ. However, it's still falling on deaf ears. And as you mentioned earlier in our conversation, if anything, since South Africa's action at the ICJ, it almost seems as if Israel has just intensified, as you said, intensified their bombardment on Gaza and Palestine particularly, and now then imploding onto Lebanon as well. So we are seeing what a lot of people are calling a potential World War III scenario, and it's causing a lot of hysteria. It's causing a lot of uproar all around the world. What are your thoughts?
Well, look, the problem that we have from a legal standpoint in relation to those ICJ rulings is that the ICJ does not have an enforcement mechanism. So what that means is it does not have its own military to enforce those decisions, and it also cannot independently impose sanctions. So really, the duty of ensuring the enforcement of those orders goes to the Security Council of the United Nations. But as your viewers might know, what we're experiencing at the Security Council is that the USA, as a permanent member that has veto power, keeps blocking those potential UN resolutions, UN Security Council resolutions that could essentially force Israel to abide by those court orders. So that is really the doom and gloom of where we are. The buck stops there. I mean, a potential issue could be trying to lobby the USA further to try and amend some of its foreign policy views, but how that might happen and how long that might take, I don't know.
It is a tricky situation, and much like with every other international body, the ICJ, the ICC, the Security Council have continued to fail many people around the world. We look at the Rwandan genocide, for example. They failed to be able to prevent that genocide because of this idea of the veto vote. And I do know that there is some reform in the hopes that they are going to add an African country or two to that list of veto countries for the Security Council. But a lot of people are questioning on whether that is going to be enough to be able to address these issues. And I mean, a lot of people question the ability of the United Nations to play any kind of big impact when it comes to assisting countries, war-torn countries around the world. But we are seeing so much of disruption, and the Middle East has now erupted into a regional war. How should supporters of Palestine be able to continue to show their solidarity as global attention is now shifting to Lebanon and possibly Iran as well?
Well, I think just on the war aspect, I mean, from a legal perspective, as a general proposition under international law, the use of force by one state against another state is prohibited. It's strictly prohibited. It should not actually take place. The exception to that, and it's quite limited, is if a state says that it is doing so as a means of self-defense. But now, self-defense is not an absolute mechanism. It is restricted. The state would need to show that the force that it is using is necessary to respond to the threat, and that the force that it is using is proportionate to the threat. Now, dropping 200,000-pound bombs on civilian infrastructure is certainly not proportionate. But I don't think it's all that bad. I mean, if you look at the how it may affect the solidarity that we're currently seeing, for many of your viewers and also for many international governments around the world, I think a couple of years ago, if you were to advocate for Palestinian rights, it was seen as a political opinion. That has now changed. And the reason that it's changed is because we have these court orders that clarify the legal position. And so anyone, whether it is in an individual, one of your listeners going to a march sometime soon, or whether it's these chief officials in high government positions, it is no longer a political view to advocate for the rights of Palestinians. It is now the legal status quo ante. It is the legal position.
I absolutely think that South Africa has been extremely, extremely successful in that regard. And I particularly remember going to protests as a child and going to, these different walks that supported Palestine as I was very, very young. And it was very much seemed as a very political opinion or very one-sided opinion. And there was a lot of hate towards people who supported Palestine. And I think that was what was successful about this time around, is that it allowed the world to open up their eyes to the truth about what is going on in Gaza, and opening up their eyes to the deep humanitarian crisis that is taking place against the people of Palestine. So I think in that way it was extremely successful, because even if I look back at October 7th, and just around that time there was clouds of misinformation that was flooding social media platforms about what was transpiring and who was at fault. So I think in a success point of view, and in terms of creating awareness, I think we have been very successful in that regard, for sure. And I know that a lot of countries and people as individuals have been undertaking boycotting to try and disable the power that Israel has. But how effective do you believe the boycotts have been, whether that be companies that are boycotting Israel or individuals that are choosing to boycott companies that support Israel?
Look, I think we need to give credit where it's owed. I think that there has been progress, but of course, there's more that can be done. And for those of your viewers that are actually based in Cape Town, tomorrow there is a mass march in Cape Town where we're hoping hundreds of thousands of people will show up, and we are marching to Parliament. And what we're doing is we're actually presenting to Parliament the apartheid bill, and we would like the apartheid bill to be enacted by Parliament. Now, South Africa is a signatory to the Apartheid Convention, but it has not yet been acted domestically into law. And what this apartheid bill will actually do is it will create the offense of apartheid. And once we have that set in place, companies that are supporting Israel, individuals that are supporting Israel, in whatever means, can be held liable for the offense of apartheid. So that's things like that. That's stuff that we can do. That's where we can make progress. And that is exactly what we're doing. So for those of you that are based in Cape Town, please come out tomorrow. Come to our Instagram page to see the details, and let's march to Parliament to hand Parliament this bill.
Absolutely. Dominic, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This conversation has been incredibly insightful. And I know that our viewers at home are feeling a lot more clarified when it comes to the legalities of the situation, when it comes to holding Israel accountable on a legal standpoint, as well as some of the ways in which they can continue to support Palestine. So thank you for sharing with us this evening, as well as sharing your expertise.
Thank you for having me.
Viewers at home, that was Dominic sharing all things when it comes to the ICJ, the ICC. How effective are these legal platforms in ensuring justice for the people of Palestine, or are they even effective at all? Let us know your thoughts on our social media platforms. And as Dominic has said, there are many ways in which you can still support Palestine and stand up against the genocide that Israel is inflicting on Palestine. Do reach out to them on their social media platforms. And if you are in the Cape Town area, please do go through and participate tomorrow. But on that note, viewers, it is time for us to head over to an ad break, and we'll come right back.